What if humanity's oldest written words were never meant to mark a beginning? What if they were meant to preserve an ending? Beneath the burning sands of southern Iraq, where the horizon wavers like breath across desert stone, fragments of ancient cities sleep in silence. The air shimmers with heat that bends light into liquid. Each brick tower that once reached toward heaven now crumbles back to earth, yet beneath the ruins, pressed into tablets no larger than your palm, wedge-shaped marks still whisper of something the world forgot. The Sumerians called their cities the first: Eridu, Uruk, Nippur, Ur. Names that carry weight even now, heavy with age. Their language appears in history fully formed, with no ancestors to trace backward. Their mathematics gave us the 60 seconds in a minute, the 360 degrees in a circle, systems so elegant we still use them 5,000 years later. Their star charts tracked Venus with accuracy we could not confirm until we built telescopes. And their ziggurats, those massive stepped pyramids rising from flat plains, aligned to celestial events with precision that feels less like discovery and more like remembrance. But here is what makes them strange. The Sumerians did not claim to have invented any of this. They said it was given. Knowledge descended from heaven, they wrote. Kingship was lowered from above. Civilization was restored, not created. Restored, that single word changes everything. Before we descend into the clay and the ruins, take a moment. Like this video and subscribe if you are drawn to mysteries that sleep between archaeology and myth, between what we know and what we have forgotten. And if you are still here, leave a comment. Tell me where you are listening from right now. Tell me what hour keeps you company. I would like to imagine this story unfolding across time zones, carried softly into sleep, wherever you are in the world. The first excavators arrived in the 1840s with shovels and ambition. They were hunting for biblical cities, for proof of ancient texts, for treasures to fill museum halls in London and Berlin and Paris. The deserts of Mesopotamia, that land between the rivers, had been described in scripture as the cradle of civilization. Eden itself was said to lie somewhere in these plains. But when the French consul Paul-Émile Botta began digging at Khorsabad in 1843, he did not find Eden. He found Assyria, massive stone bulls with human heads, walls covered in reliefs depicting kings and conquests, cuneiform inscriptions that no one could yet read. The headlines across Europe proclaimed a revolution. The Bible was true. Ancient civilizations did exist, and they had left traces. Within a decade, the race was on. British archaeologist Austen Henry Layard excavated Nimrud and Nineveh. German teams pushed into Babylon, and slowly, through trial and error, scholars began to decipher the wedge-shaped script pressed into clay tablets by the thousands. But beneath the Assyrian and Babylonian layers, beneath the empires that dominated biblical narratives, excavators kept finding something older. Cities that predated Babylon by 1,000 years, temples rebuilt so many times their foundations descended into darkness. And a language that was not Akkadian, not Semitic, not related to anything anyone had ever seen before. They called the people who spoke this language the Sumerians. The name came from the Akkadian word Shuma, meaning land of the civilized kings. But the Sumerians themselves had called their land Kiengir, the land of the noble lords. And their cities, scattered across what is now southern Iraq, bore names that would become legendary: Eridu, Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Nippur, Kish. Each one was a world unto itself. A city-state with its own patron deity, its own king, its own ziggurat, rising like a mountain from the flat alluvial plain. In 1853, British diplomat John George Taylor began excavating at a site the local Bedouin called Tall al-Muqayya, the Mound of Pitch. Ancient texts suggested this was Ur, the city of Abraham, birthplace of the patriarch who would father 3 religions. Taylor dug into the largest structure, a massive stepped platform of mud brick. The local workers called it a ziggurat, from the Akkadian word zigguratu, meaning to build high. As they cleared away centuries of sand and debris, the structure's shape emerged. A rectangular base, roughly 200 feet by 100 feet, 3 visible tiers ascending in steps, each level smaller than the one below. At the summit, Taylor expected to find a temple. What he found instead was a foundation. The shrine that once crowned the ziggurat had long since collapsed. But the platform itself, the massive stepped pyramid that served as its base, remained intact, built of millions of sun-baked bricks, each one stamped with the name of a king, Ur-Nammu, king of Ur, builder of the ziggurat, circa 2000 BCE. But beneath Ur-Nammu's bricks, the excavators found older layers, and beneath those, older still. The ziggurat had been rebuilt multiple times, each king adding to the work of his predecessors, raising the platform higher, making the sacred mountain taller. The oldest foundation stones, when they finally reached them, could not be dated with certainty. But they were ancient, far older than Ur-Nammu, perhaps as old as the city itself, and Ur was not unique. In 1912, German archaeologist Walter André began excavating Eridu, a site 12 miles southwest of Ur. Local tradition held that Eridu was the first city ever built, the place where kingship descended from heaven, according to Sumerian texts. André's team dug through temple after temple. 18 distinct building phases, each one constructed directly atop the ruins of the last, each one oriented to the same sacred spot, each one honoring the same deity, Enki, god of the deep waters and keeper of wisdom. The temples grew progressively simpler as they descended. The uppermost structures were elaborate, with multiple rooms and decorative elements. But the deeper they dug, the more austere the architecture became, until they reached the bottom. Temple 1, the oldest structure. Dated to approximately 5000 BCE through ceramic analysis of the surrounding debris. A simple rectangular room with an offering platform, walls barely 5 feet high, built of mud brick on a foundation of river stone. But simple does not mean crude. The walls were straight, the corners precise, the foundation carefully leveled, and the orientation, even at this earliest stage, was deliberate. The temple faced east, toward the rising sun, aligned with the same astronomical principles that would guide Sumerian architecture for the next 3,000 years. Whoever built Temple 1 at Eridu already understood construction, already knew how to work stone and mud, already possessed knowledge that should have required generations to develop. But there was no trail of failed experiments, no collapsed prototypes, just the temple, ancient and complete, waiting beneath the sands. The pattern repeated at every major Sumerian site. At Uruk, British archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley uncovered the White Temple, a massive structure sitting atop a 40-foot artificial platform. Dated to approximately 3200 BCE, it was one of the largest buildings of its era. Its walls were buttressed, decorated with patterns that created shadow and light. The interior contained a central hall with an altar, storage rooms, and a courtyard open to the sky. But beneath the White Temple, excavators found older platforms, and beneath those, traces of even earlier sacred buildings, layer upon layer, descending through centuries of occupation. Each one showed sophistication, each one demonstrated planning. There was no gradual progression from simple to complex. The earliest structures were already competent, already designed by minds that understood architecture at a level that should not exist in the archaeological record of early human settlement. And then there were the city walls. At Uruk, the fortification stretched for nearly 6 miles, enclosing over 1,000 acres of urban space. The walls were massive, 40 feet high in places, built of millions of mud bricks that had to be molded, dried, transported, and laid in courses with engineering precision. Constructing walls of that scale requires mathematics. You must calculate volumes, manage supply chains, schedule work crews, feed thousands of laborers, and maintain the project across years or decades. This level of organization typically appears after centuries of smaller civic projects. Towns build granaries, then modest fortifications, then gradually expand as population and resources allow. But Uruk's walls appear in the archaeological record already monumental, already enclosing a fully planned city with distinct districts for craftsmen, separate zones for temples, and streets laid out in grids that facilitated drainage and traffic flow. How? The question haunted every excavation. The deeper the archaeologist dug, the more sophisticated the findings became. It was as if civilization had arrived fully formed, carrying with it knowledge that should have taken generations to accumulate. In 1922, Leonard Woolley began a systematic excavation of Ur that would last 12 years. His team uncovered the Royal Cemetery, a burial ground containing tombs of extraordinary wealth, golden headdresses, lapis lazuli jewelry, musical instruments inlaid with precious materials. But beneath the cemetery, Woolley's workers kept digging, through occupation layers, through ash and pottery, until they hit something unexpected. clean clay, sterile, uniform, no pottery shards, no ash, no human trace whatsoever, just water-deposited sediment stretching down 8 feet thick. Woolley stood in the trench and stared at the profile. This was not the gradual accumulation of seasonal floods. This was deposition from a single, overwhelming event. Water moving with such force and volume that it scoured the landscape clean, leaving nothing but mud. He ordered his workers to dig deeper. Beneath the flood layer, artifacts appeared again, pottery of a different style. Stone tools. Charred walls. Evidence of habitation that had ended abruptly when the waters came. Woolley called a press conference. He announced that he had found evidence of Noah's flood, the biblical deluge, the catastrophe that divided human history into before and after. The academic community was skeptical. A local flood, perhaps, but not the global inundation described in Genesis. Yet the pattern repeated at other sites. At Shurapak, excavators found the same sterile clay layer, roughly 2 meters thick, separating earlier occupation from later rebuilding. At Kish, another flood layer. At Eridu, evidence of abandonment and reconstruction following major inundation. The dates clustered around 2900 BCE, precisely the period when Sumerian texts described the flood sweeping over the land. And that was when archaeologists began to read the tablets more carefully. Among the thousands of cuneiform documents recovered from Sumerian cities was a text known as the Sumerian King List. Found in multiple copies from different cities, it recorded every ruler who had ever governed the land, stretching back to the very beginning. The list opened with a declaration. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Then it named 8 kings, each one ruling for tens of thousands of years. Alulaim, 28,800 years, Alogar, 36,000 years, Enman-Luana, 40,200 years. And after listing these impossible reigns, the text stated simply, "Then the flood swept over." Following that line, the reigns shortened dramatically. The post-flood kings ruled for hundreds of years, then decades, then lifespans that fell within the realm of human possibility. Scholars dismiss the pre-flood section as mythology. The numbers were clearly symbolic, not historical. But the Sumerian king list was not written as mythology. It was a bureaucratic document, copied and preserved with the same precision used for temple inventories and tax records. And the archaeological evidence was beginning to align with its narrative. The flood had come, cities had drowned, and when the waters receded, something had changed. The age of the impossible gave way to the age of the mortal. The discovery that troubled archaeologists most was the absence of evolution. Civilizations are supposed to develop gradually. Stone tools lead to bronze, simple shelters evolve into cities, pictographs become alphabets. But Sumerian civilization appeared to skip the rehearsal. Writing arrived complete. Mathematics came encoded in base 60. Astronomy tracked planetary cycles with precision. Architecture followed geometric principles that would not be rediscovered for millennia. In 1877, French archaeologist Ernest de Sarzec began excavating at Tello, ancient Lagash. Among the ruins, he found thousands of clay tablets, administrative records, legal contracts, letters between kings, and mathematical tables, multiplication extending into the thousands. Division using fractions, geometric calculations for irregular field measurements. All of it recorded in the distinctive wedge-shaped script the Sumerians called cuneiform. The tablets were dated to approximately 2400 BCE, but the mathematics they contained showed no developmental stages, no awkward attempts, no corrections or refinements, just competence from the earliest examples. When linguists finally deciphered Sumerian in the late 1800s, they encountered another mystery. The language had no known relatives. It was not Semitic like Akkadian or Hebrew, not Indo-European like Greek or Sanskrit, not related to any language family anyone could identify. Sumerian stood alone, a linguistic orphan, as if it had fallen from somewhere else entirely. By the early 1900s, a picture had emerged that challenged every assumption about human development. The Sumerians appeared in history already literate, already numerate, already building cities with urban planning that rivaled modern standards. And their own records claimed they did not invent any of it. They said it descended from heaven. They said it was given by beings called the Anunnaki. They said civilization was restored after the flood, not created for the first time. Mainstream archaeology dismissed this as religious mythology. The Anunnaki were gods, divine beings, symbols of natural forces personified. But the more tablets were translated, the stranger the descriptions became. The Anunnaki were not portrayed as distant cosmic forces. They were described as teachers, engineers, lawgivers who walked among humans and shared specific knowledge. Agriculture, irrigation, mathematics, writing, astronomy, and when the flood came, according to the texts, they withdrew. The age of direct communion ended. Knowledge had to be preserved by human hands alone, which is perhaps why the Sumerians wrote everything down, why they pressed thousands upon thousands of tablets into clay, why they built ziggurats as monuments to memory. Because they understood what it meant to lose everything. They carried the trauma of the flood in their collective identity. They saw themselves not as pioneers, but as survivors, not as inventors, but as restorers. And if that is true, then the Ziggurats were never about reaching heaven through human pride. They were about remembering when heaven was closer, when knowledge flowed freely, when the teachers walked among students and shared understanding without need for clay or symbol or the desperate preservation of fragments. The desert wind moves across the excavation sites now, carrying sand that slowly reburies what decades of digging revealed. The Ziggurats stand silent, stepped pyramids pointing toward a sky that no longer answers. And beneath the ruins, pressed into clay harder than stone, the memory waits. Stand in the ruins of Ur on a morning when the desert air is still cool. The ziggurat rises before you, reconstructed in the 1980s by Saddam Hussein using the original Sumerian bricks wherever they survived. 3 massive tiers ascending toward the sky, each level smaller than the one below, staircases climbing the exterior walls at precise angles. The structure is aligned to true north with an accuracy that rivals modern buildings. The dimensions follow mathematical ratios that appear in musical intervals, in planetary orbits, in the sacred geometry of temples across cultures separated by thousands of miles and millennia. This is not approximate, this is precise. And that precision is what troubles scholars most. Because when you examine the archaeological record of human development, you expect to see progress, trial and error, gradual refinement. Mistakes that lead to improvements that accumulate over generations until competence emerges. The earliest Egyptian pyramids show exactly this pattern. The step pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara, built around 2630 BCE, was revolutionary, but it was also experimental. The architect Imhotep was clearly figuring things out as he went. The internal chambers show modifications. The exterior casing stones vary in size. It is the work of genius, yes, but genius feeling its way forward. Then came the bent pyramid at Dashur, where the builders changed the angle midway through construction because they realized the original slope was too steep and the structure was becoming unstable. A magnificent failure that taught them what not to do. And finally, after learning from these experiments, they built the Great Pyramid of Khufu. Perfect angles, massive scale, the culmination of decades of accumulated knowledge. You can trace the progression from step pyramid to bent pyramid to Great Pyramid, from experiment to mistake to mastery. But with Sumerian ziggurats, there is no such progression. The ziggurat at Eridu, the oldest we have found, shows the same architectural competence as the ziggurat at Ur, built 1,500 years later. The temple platforms at Uruk from 3200 BCE demonstrate the same engineering principles as later structures. There is no learning curve visible in the archaeology, no failed prototypes, no intermediate stages where builders were still figuring out load-bearing mathematics or discovering through collapsed structures what angles were too steep. The ziggurats appear in history already knowing how to stand, and it is not just the architecture. In 1902, French archaeologist Henri de Genouillac excavated at Drehem, a small administrative center near Nippur. Among the ruins he found tablets, thousands of them, bureaucratic records from the Ur-3 period, around 2100 BCE, tax receipts, grain inventories, livestock counts, worker rosters listing names, occupations, and daily rations, boring administrative debris, except for one detail. The mathematics were flawless, calculations involving thousands of units, compound fractions, interest rates applied over multiple years, geometric measurements for irregular field plots, all of it executed without error, using a base 60 numerical system of such elegance that we still use it today. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. These are not arbitrary divisions, they are Sumerian. inherited from a mathematical framework developed so long ago that even the Sumerians did not claim credit for inventing it. Their scribal training texts, manuals used to teach mathematics to students in temple schools, contain a revealing phrase repeated across generations. From distant days, the scribal art has been practiced. Not we created this art, not our teachers developed this system. From distant days. A passive construction that places the origin beyond memory. Before the current age, before living tradition could trace it back to a specific teacher or moment of invention. The phrase appears in medical texts as well. Pharmacological recipes using dozens of plant compounds, surgical procedures described with clinical precision, treatments for infections, broken bones, digestive ailments. These remedies work. Modern pharmacology has confirmed that many Sumerian medicines contain biologically active compounds effective for their stated purposes, but there is no record of how this knowledge was acquired. No tablets describing trial and error, no documentation of the centuries of careful observation required to determine which plants help, which harm, at what doses, in what combinations. The knowledge simply exists, already compiled, already refined, already encoded in clay, as though documenting a tradition that predated the documentation itself. And then there is the language. When linguist Henry Rawlinson deciphered cuneiform in the 1840s by comparing trilingual inscriptions from Behistun in Persia, he initially focused on Akkadian, a Semitic language related to Hebrew and Arabic. Akkadian made sense. It had grammatical relatives. It fit into known language families. But beneath the Akkadian texts carved into the same monuments was another script. Same wedge-shaped symbols, but the language was incomprehensible. It followed none of the patterns Rawlinson recognized. This was Sumerian. And for decades, scholars debated whether it was even a real language or some kind of coded priestly script. The breakthrough came when they realized Sumerian was agglutinative, building complex meanings by stringing together smaller units like beads on a string. Similar to Turkish or Finnish in structure, but related to neither. In fact, Sumerian appeared to be related to nothing. Over a century of linguistic analysis has failed to connect Sumerian to any known language family. It stands alone, an isolate, as if its speakers had arrived in Mesopotamia carrying a fully developed tongue with no evolutionary history visible in the archaeological record. Languages are not supposed to work like this. They evolve. They borrow. They show traces of contact with neighboring tongues. Even isolated languages like Basque carry evidence of their development over time. But Sumerian appears in the earliest tablets already complex, already capable of expressing legal nuances, poetic metaphors, astronomical calculations, and medical procedures with equal facility. And here is what makes this even stranger. The Sumerians themselves did not claim to have invented their language. In a hymn to Nisaba, goddess of writing and grain, one line reads, "She who counts the stars gave us the sacred script. Not we developed writing, not our ancestors created cuneiform. She gave us." The language was a gift, descended from divine sources, taught by beings the Sumerians called the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came. Mainstream scholarship interprets this as mythology. Gods are anthropomorphized natural forces. Divine teachers are symbolic representations of cultural heroes whose real identities were forgotten over time. But the Sumerians were not a culture given to vague symbolism. They documented everything. Grain shipments recorded to the bushel, star positions tracked to the day, temple inventories listing every cup and spoon. When they wrote that knowledge was given, that kingship descended from heaven, that civilization was restored after the flood, they may have been recording the only way they knew how to describe something they witnessed or inherited memory of, but could not fully explain. Because the archaeological evidence increasingly suggests they were right about one thing. They did not invent civilization, they inherited it. The flood layer discovered by Leonard Woolley at Ur was not unique. It appears across Mesopotamia, dated consistently to around 2900 BCE. Cities buried beneath water-deposited silt, occupation interrupted, then resumption, but changed. Before the flood, according to Sumerian king lists, rulers reigned for impossible lengths of time. Alulim, 28,800 years. Alalgar, 36,000 years. After the flood, the reigns become mortal. Hundreds of years, then decades, then lifespans recognizably human. If we read this not as mythology but as chronicle, what it describes is a break in continuity. a catastrophic disruption that divided history into before and after. Before the flood, a culture capable of tracking astronomical cycles spanning thousands of years, recording them in units called Sa, where 1 Sa equals 3,600 years. Encoding this knowledge into a king list that treats cosmic time and human rulership as inseparable. After the flood, survivors, rebuilding, preserving fragments, pressing knowledge into clay because clay endures when everything else drowns. The Ziggurats in this reading were not monuments to human achievement, they were monuments to loss. Each one a massive stepped pyramid rising from the plain. Each one oriented to celestial events. Each one topped with a shrine furnished with offerings in case the gods returned. They were waiting platforms, invitations, architectural prayers saying, "We remember when you walked among us, we preserve what you taught. If you come back, we have prepared a place for you." But the gods did not return. Or if they did, they came quietly, in dreams and visions, no longer in whatever form they once took, that the Sumerians could describe only as beings of light descending from heaven. The age of direct communion was over, and all that remained were the monuments, the tablets, the star charts, the mathematical tables, the medical texts, the ziggurats pointing upward into silence. Fragments of a knowledge system. The Sumerians spent 3,000 years preserving, copying, teaching, encoding into clay and stone and ritual, desperately trying to maintain a connection to something that had been lost. This is the mystery that haunts every excavation. Not how did the Sumerians achieve so much, but who taught them? And what happened to the teachers when the flood swept over and the world began again? The desert wind moves across the ruins as afternoon heat builds. The ziggurat stands silent against the sky, its stepped profile casting geometric shadows across sand. And somewhere in that silence, between the perfect angles and the impossible mathematics, between the flood layer and the tablets pressed by hands 5,000 years dead, a question waits. Were the ziggurats truly built by the Sumerians? Or were they restoring something already ancient when the first cities rose from the post-flood silt? The evidence suggests the latter, but evidence can only take us so far. To understand what the Sumerians inherited, we must descend deeper, into the tablets themselves, into the astronomical observations, into the mathematical systems, into the strange and specific knowledge they recorded with such care. Because buried in those cuneiform marks is testimony, not mythology, not allegory, memory. The shovel strikes packed earth at dawn. The sound is sharp, clean, followed by the soft scrape of metal against sand. At Eridu, 12 miles southwest of Ur, the excavation pit descends through centuries like a knife through layered cake. Each layer tells a story, each stratum marks a moment frozen in time. The uppermost level, barely 3 feet below the modern surface, contains Islamic period pottery, fragments of glazed ceramics dated to the 8th century CE. Beneath that, Sasanian coins from the 3rd century CE. Then older still, Parthian brick, Roman glass beads carried along ancient trade routes. The diggers work slowly, brushing away sand, photographing each artifact in place before lifting it, recording depth, orientation, and context. Modern archaeology is not treasure hunting, it is documentation. The relationship between objects matters more than the objects themselves. At 10 feet down, the pottery changes. The sherds become simpler, unglazed. Shapes grow more utilitarian. This is the Neo-Babylonian period, around 600 BCE. Clay tablets appear here, administrative records pressed with cuneiform, listing grain shipments and worker rations. Deeper still, 15 feet below the surface, the Old Babylonian period, 2000 BCE, more tablets, legal contracts, letters between merchants, mathematical exercises copied by students learning the scribal arts. The clay changes color at 18 feet, from buff to gray, a marker layer that separates Babylonian occupation from something older, Ur-3 period, 2100 BCE, the age when King Ur-Nammu built the great ziggurat at Ur. Brick stamps bearing his name appear in the soil. Foundation deposits, ritualistic burials of clay cones and copper figurines placed to sanctify construction. But beneath Ur-3, the sequence becomes strange. At 22 feet, occupation debris thins. Ash layers appear, evidence of burning. Collapsed mud brick walls, their edges melted by intense heat. Pottery crushed beneath fallen architecture. Then at 25 feet, nothing, clean silt. water-deposited clay stretching down 2 meters thick, sterile. Uniform, no pottery, no ash, no human trace. The flood layer. Leonard Woolley stood in this exact position in 1929, staring at the profile wall of his excavation trench. His workers had wanted to stop. They assumed they had reached virgin soil, the natural substrate beneath the city. But Woolley ordered them to dig deeper. And beneath the flood silt, artifacts appeared again. Pottery of a different style, painted ware with geometric designs unknown in later periods, stone tools, obsidian blades imported from Anatolia, 500 miles north, evidence of long-distance trade networks operating before the catastrophe. The structures beneath the flood were burned, charred beams, walls scorched black, as though the pre-flood city had ended in fire, only to be buried beneath water shortly after. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials from this lower layer, charcoal from the burned buildings, gave consistent results. 2900 BCE, plus or minus 50 years. The same date appeared at Shuruppak, ancient city of the flood hero Ziusudra. At Kish, at Uruk. Across southern Mesopotamia, a band of sterile silt marks the same moment. Something happened, something sudden. Something catastrophic enough to deposit meters of sediment and interrupt occupation across an entire region. But the flooding was not uniform. Some cities show thicker deposits than others. Eridu, closer to the coast, has deeper silt layers. Nippur, farther inland and at higher elevation, shows only traces. Uruk sits between with moderate deposits. This pattern suggests not a single global deluge, but a massive regional inundation. Perhaps a storm surge from the Persian Gulf. Perhaps catastrophic river flooding when snowmelt from northern mountains coincided with heavy seasonal rains. Perhaps both simultaneously. The clay itself tells the story. Geologists analyzing the silt found it was water-sorted. Fine particles settling evenly the way sediment deposits when carried by slow-moving floodwater rather than dumped by human activity or blown by wind. And the silt contains marine microfossils. Tiny shells of organisms that live in saltwater, not fresh water. Evidence that the Persian Gulf, normally 100 miles south of Ur, had pushed inland, mixing with river overflow to create a brackish inland sea that drowned the coastal plain. For people living in the lowlands between the Tigris and Euphrates, this would have been total. Their entire world, every field they knew, every city they could reach, submerged. The horizon in all directions would have been water. When the floodwaters finally receded, perhaps weeks or months later, the survivors returned to find their cities buried. The temples they had worshipped in, the homes they had lived in, the markets where they had traded, all gone beneath thick mud that dried hard as stone under the desert sun. They had two choices: abandon the sites entirely and start fresh elsewhere, or rebuild on top of the ruins, restoring what had been lost. They chose restoration. At Eridu, Temple 7 was built directly above Temple 6, which sat above Temple 5, which rested on the drowned remains of earlier shrines. Each one positioned in the exact same sacred spot, as though the location itself held power that transcended any individual structure. The ziggurat would rise here eventually, constructed by Ur-Nammu to honor a tradition already ancient in his time. A mountain built of brick to reach toward gods who had once been closer. But the foundations, the oldest temple platforms buried deepest beneath the later construction, predated Ur-Nammu by 2,000 years, predated the flood by centuries. When excavators reached the lowest levels at Eridu, Temple 1, they found architecture that should not exist at that depth, at that date. The walls were straight, corners precise, foundation stones carefully leveled and oriented east toward the rising sun. This was not primitive experimental construction. This was competent work executed by builders who already understood their craft. Carbon dating of organic materials trapped in the mortar gave a date that stunned the archaeological community. 5000 BCE, perhaps earlier, 7,000 years ago, 3,000 years before the pyramids, 4,000 years before Greece or Rome, and already the builders at Eridu knew geometry. Already they aligned structures to celestial events. Already they constructed platforms designed to elevate sacred space above the mundane earth. The same pattern appeared at Uruk. The White Temple, sitting atop a 40-foot artificial platform, was dated to 3200 BCE, but beneath it, excavators found older platforms, and beneath those, traces of even earlier construction. Each layer showed refinement. Each structure demonstrated knowledge. There was no progression from crude to sophisticated. The earliest examples were already competent. At Ur, the royal cemetery yielded treasures that revolutionized understanding of Sumerian craftsmanship: golden headdresses with lapis lazuli inlay, lyres decorated with bull heads cast in precious metals, jewelry demonstrating advanced metallurgical techniques. But more significant than the wealth were the human remains. In several tombs, excavators found evidence of human sacrifice. Rows of attendants, servants, and musicians buried alongside their rulers. They wore their finest clothes. They held cups that contained traces of poison. They had gone willingly, or perhaps drugged, into death to serve their masters in the afterlife. This level of social organization, where dozens of people would consent to ritual death, implies powerful ideological control. A belief system so deeply embedded that individual survival meant less than cosmic duty. What could create such conviction? Perhaps the memory of a world that had ended. A flood that had nearly destroyed everything, a salvation granted only through divine intervention. If your culture believed the gods had saved you once, that they had chosen your ancestors for survival when millions drowned, then serving those gods even unto death might seem not just reasonable but necessary. The tablets from Ur contain prayers that echo this desperation. Hymns to Nana, the moon god, begging for continued protection. Rituals designed to ensure the flood would never come again. Offerings made to maintain cosmic order, to keep chaos at bay. These were not abstract spiritual exercises, they were survival mechanisms, memory encoded into ritual, trauma transformed into theology. And everywhere in the archaeological record, beneath the temples and palaces and city walls, the flood layer waited. Physical evidence that the catastrophe the Sumerians remembered was not myth but history. Textual analysis, what the tablets say. In museum collections across the world, Sumerian tablets rest in climate-controlled darkness. Clay fragments pressed with wedge-shaped marks, each one a voice from the deep past. The British Museum in London holds over 130,000 cuneiform tablets. The Louvre in Paris houses tens of thousands more. The University of Pennsylvania, the Oriental Institute in Chicago, the Pergamon Museum in Berlin all maintain collections that have barely been fully catalogued, much less translated. Thousands upon thousands of tablets, most containing mundane information, tax receipts, grain inventories, legal contracts, but scattered among the bureaucratic records are texts that reveal something stranger. One tablet, catalogued as CBS 10996 in the University of Pennsylvania collection, contains an astronomical observation. The text is damaged, missing portions, but what remains is clear. In the month of Nisanu, on the 15th day, Venus appeared in the east. In the month of Elulu, on the 11th day, Venus disappeared in the west. The observation records Venus tracking its synodic cycle, the 584-day period it takes to return to the same position relative to Earth and the Sun. This is precise astronomy. It requires continuous observation across years. Careful record-keeping. Mathematical models to predict future positions. The tablet is dated to the Ur-3 period around 2000 BCE, but the text itself claims to be copying an older source. The scribe notes at the end, from the ancient series. Which series? How ancient? The tablet does not say, but the implication is clear. The observation was not made during the Ur-3 period. It was recorded then, copied from earlier documents, preserved because astronomical knowledge was considered sacred, essential, not to be lost. Another tablet from Nippur contains a mathematical problem. The text presents a square with diagonals marked. It asks the student to calculate the length of the diagonal if each side measures 30 units. The answer provided is remarkably precise. The tablet gives the square root of 2 as 1. 44421 accurate to 6 decimal places. This level of precision should not exist in 2000 BCE. The Greeks would not calculate irrational numbers with such accuracy for another 500 years. European mathematicians would not match this precision until the Renaissance. Yet here it sits, pressed into clay by a Sumerian student copying an exercise from a teacher who learned it from an earlier teacher in a chain stretching back beyond memory. The tablet does not explain how to derive the square root of 2. It simply states it as though the method were already known, already assumed, not requiring explanation. This is the pattern across Sumerian mathematical texts. They present solutions without showing work. They state formulas without deriving them. as though the knowledge were being transmitted rather than discovered. Medical texts show the same characteristic. One tablet from the Old Babylonian period, now in the Yale Babylonian collection, contains over a dozen prescriptions. For fever, grind together thyme, juniper and willow bark, mix with beer, administer for 3 days. For digestive ailment, combine fermented grain with dates and cumin. Drink twice daily until symptoms cease. For wound infection, apply honey mixed with ground antimony. Cover with clean linen. Change daily. These treatments work. Modern pharmacology has confirmed that thyme contains thymol, an antiseptic. Willow bark contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin. Honey has antibacterial properties. Antimony compounds can fight infection. But how did the Sumerians know? Trial and error over centuries should produce some record of failures. Treatments that made patients worse. Remedies abandoned when they proved ineffective, yet the tablets present only successes. Only formulas that work. As though the experimentation had already been done, the useless treatments already filtered out, and only the effective knowledge had been preserved. One medical text contains a revealing line. From the ancient physicians, these remedies are passed down. Again, the passive construction. Knowledge transmitted from earlier sources, not created, not discovered, but inherited. Legal texts reveal similar sophistication. The Code of Ur-Nammu, dated to approximately 2100 BCE, is among the oldest law codes ever discovered. It predates Hammurabi's famous code by 300 years. But Ur-Nammu's laws are not primitive. They distinguish between intentional and accidental harm. They establish different penalties for crimes against property versus crimes against persons. They include provisions for divorce, inheritance, and commercial contracts. This is complex jurisprudence. It anticipates edge cases. It considers intent. It creates hierarchies of punishment proportional to offense. Legal systems. This nuance typically evolve through generations of case law. Disputes reveal gaps. Judges make rulings. Those rulings become precedent. Gradually, through accumulated decisions, a sophisticated legal framework emerges. But Ur-Nammu's code appears already sophisticated, already comprehensive, as though it were codifying existing practices rather than inventing new ones. The prologue to the code states, after Am and Enlil had turned over the kingship of Ur to Nanna, Ur-Nammu, the mighty warrior, king of Ur, king of Sumer and Akkad, by the might of Nanna, lord of the city, established equity in the land. Established equity, not created law, established it. Restored order that had existed before and been disrupted. Even in legal texts the theme repeats. Restoration, not creation. The most revealing tablets are the creation myths themselves. The Enuma Elish, the Atrahasis epic, the Eridu Genesis. These texts describe how humanity came to be, how knowledge was given, how civilization was established. They are not vague poetic allegories, they are procedural. They describe steps, sequences, materials. The Atrahasis epic, preserved in multiple copies from different periods, opens with divine labor disputes. The younger gods grow weary of maintaining the world. They dig canals, dredge rivers, build temples. After 3,600 years, one Sar cycle, they revolt. The elder gods convene. They need workers. The goddess Nintu, also called Beletili, is tasked with creating humanity. The text is explicit about the process. She takes clay from the Apsu, the primordial waters. She mixes it with the blood of a slain god, Wi-Ilah, whose essence provides something the clay alone cannot. Intelligence. Spirit. The capacity for thought. Nintu mixes the materials. She shapes forms. 7 times she tries. 7 prototypes, each one flawed. One cannot speak clearly, another has weak eyesight. A third has paralyzed hands. Enki, god of wisdom, assigns each defective creation a role. The mute one becomes a musician, the blind one a singer. Each flaw is accommodated, each being given purpose despite imperfection. Finally, the process stabilizes. Functional humans are created. 14 birth goddesses, 7 creating males, 7 creating females, produce populations capable of reproduction and labor. This is not poetry, this is process documentation. Trial and error, failed attempts, incremental improvement. The language of experimentation. Modern readers see metaphor because the alternative is too strange. But the Sumerians were not a metaphorical people. When they recorded grain shipments, they listed exact quantities. When they tracked stars, they noted precise positions. When they described legal procedures, they specified every step. Why would their creation accounts suddenly shift into vague symbolism? Perhaps it would not. Perhaps they were describing, in the only vocabulary available to them, something they witnessed or inherited knowledge of. A process they could not fully explain, but felt compelled to record. The tablets describing the Anunnaki carry the same clinical tone. These beings are not portrayed as distant cosmic forces. They have names, genealogies, specific responsibilities. Enki governs freshwater and wisdom. Enlil controls storms and agriculture. Ninhursag oversees birth and fertility. Utu manages justice and the sun's course. Each one is assigned a domain. Each one teaches specific knowledge: agriculture, irrigation, mathematics, writing, astronomy, metalwork. One hymn to Enki states, "He placed in order the divine decrees. He made the earth produce. He spread the pickaxe in the basket. He laid foundations for the settlements." Not symbolic foundations, actual infrastructure. Pickaxes and baskets are tools, not metaphors. Another text describes Enlil's gift. He brought forth the seed of the land from the earth. He organized work of plowing and sowing. He set the cattle pens and sheepfolds in order. Practical instruction, animal husbandry, agriculture, the skills necessary for settled civilization. The tablets do not describe these beings as omnipotent. They grow tired, they make mistakes, they debate decisions, they eat and drink. They're powerful, yes, but not transcendent. They operate within time, within physical limitation, within the same reality humans inhabit. This has led some scholars to propose that the Anunnaki were not purely mythological but represented something historical. Perhaps ancestral elites, perhaps pre-flood leaders whose memory was preserved and gradually elevated into divine status. The Sumerian king list supports this reading. It describes certain early kings as children of divine parents, human mothers, Anunnaki fathers, hybrid lineages blending mortal and divine blood. This motif appears across cultures: the Nephilim in Hebrew texts, the demigods of Greece, the hero kings of Hindu epics, always the same pattern. Beings from elsewhere intermarrying with humans, producing offspring who bridge two worlds. If we strip away the divine titles and read these as historical chronicles, what emerges is a picture of knowledge transmission. Teachers instructing students. Elites sharing specialized knowledge with populations who lacked it. The students, grateful and overwhelmed, remembered their teachers as gods. Because what else would you call beings who possessed understanding so far beyond your own that it seemed supernatural? The tablets preserve this memory, not as history in the modern sense with dates and verified facts, but as testimony, as the best attempt of a surviving culture to document where their knowledge came from. And consistently, across thousands of tablets, the answer was the same: it was given. It descended from heaven. It was taught by the Anunnaki, not invented, not discovered, given. Geological context: reading the earth. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers do not flow as they did in Sumerian times. 5,000 years of sedimentation have altered their courses. Ancient port cities now sit miles inland. Coastlines have shifted, the Persian Gulf has receded, but the earth remembers. Core samples taken from the Mesopotamian floodplain reveal alternating layers of silt and clay. Each layer represents a different depositional environment. River overflow leaves fine grey clay. Marine transgression deposits buff-colored silt with shell fragments. Wind-blown dust creates reddish-brown layers. Reading these cores is like reading tree rings. Each band marks a moment in climatic history. Between depths corresponding to approximately 3000 and 2900 BCE, the cores show something unusual. A thick layer of marine-origin silt containing saltwater microfossils. Overlying this is a band of freshwater clay, evidence of massive river flooding. The two deposits are nearly simultaneous, separated by only thin bands of sediment representing perhaps days or weeks. This suggests a compound disaster. First, a storm surge from the Persian Gulf pushed inland, perhaps driven by a hurricane or tsunami. Then, shortly after, catastrophic river flooding overwhelmed the region, possibly triggered by unseasonable snowmelt in the mountains where the Tigris and Euphrates originate. The combined effect would have been devastating. Saltwater inundation from the south meeting freshwater deluge from the north. the entire southern Mesopotamian plain transformed into an inland sea. Climate models reconstructing conditions in the late 4th millennium BCE support this scenario. The period around 3000 BCE saw increased climate variability, wet years alternating with droughts, stronger monsoons, more extreme weather patterns. This matches the archaeological evidence. Cities abandoned during droughts were reoccupied when rains returned. Trade routes shifted as water sources dried up or flooded. Political power moved between regions as environmental conditions changed. The flood of 2900 BCE was likely the most extreme event in a period of climatic instability. Not unique, but catastrophic enough to leave a permanent mark in both the geological record and human memory. And it was not the first such event. Deeper cores reveal earlier flood layers. One particularly significant deposit dates to approximately 5000 BCE, another to 7000 BCE. Each one marks a moment of inundation. Each one interrupts occupation debris. Each one represents catastrophe and rebuilding. If we extend the timeline back further, to the end of the last ice age, the pattern intensifies. Between 12,000 and 10,000 BCE, global sea levels rose over 100 meters as glaciers melted. Coastlines worldwide were drowned. River valleys became bays. Islands vanished. The Persian Gulf, currently a shallow sea, was dry land during the Ice Age. A river valley fed by the Tigris, Euphrates, and other rivers now submerged. Humans almost certainly lived there. Followed game, fished the rivers, built settlements along fertile banks. When the ice melted and the seas rose, that entire landscape drowned. Every settlement, every campsite, every trace of human presence now rests beneath 200 feet of seawater. If there were cultures living in the Persian Gulf Basin during the Ice Age, we have no way to excavate them, no way to know what they built, what they knew, what they preserved. But if those coastal populations fled the rising waters and moved inland to higher ground in southern Mesopotamia, they would have carried their knowledge with them: agricultural techniques, astronomical observations, architectural principles. And that knowledge, passed down through oral tradition for thousands of years, might eventually have been encoded into clay tablets by their distant descendants, the Sumerians. This is speculation, but it aligns with the evidence. The sudden appearance of sophisticated knowledge, the lack of developmental stages, the repeated claims that civilization was restored, not invented. Perhaps the Sumerians were not the first. Perhaps they were the inheritors of a much older tradition that had survived multiple catastrophes, each one erasing material evidence while preserving fragmented memory. The geological record cannot prove this, but it creates space for the possibility. Because the Earth shows us clearly that the flood was real, that multiple floods were real, that Mesopotamia has been repeatedly inundated by waters that drowned cities and forced populations to flee. And if that is true, then the Sumerian tablets describing a world before the flood, a world where knowledge flowed freely and rulers reigned in cosmic time, may not be mythology at all. They may be geology, catastrophe encoded into myth, survival encoded into kingship, memory encoded into clay. The flood happened. The question is not whether it was real. The question is, what drowned beneath those waters? And what the survivors carried with them when the waters finally recede? In a vault beneath the British Museum, tablet BM 1525 rests in archival foam. The clay is cool, slightly porous, inscribed with columns of numbers that march across its surface in perfect rows. At first glance, it appears to be a multiplication table. Numbers arranged in sequences, each one the product of the last multiplied by a constant factor. But look closer. The sequences are not random practice exercises. They encode geometric progressions. Each column represents powers of specific numbers. 2, 3, 5, 6, 10, 12, 20, 30. These are the factors of 60, the building blocks of the base 60 system. The tablet is teaching students how to think in sexagesimal mathematics, how to calculate compound interest, how to solve complex division problems by converting them into multiplication, how to manipulate fractions using reciprocals. This is advanced mathematics, the kind that emerges after centuries of commercial activity requiring precise calculation, the kind that develops when merchants need to split profits, when temple administrators need to calculate grain rations for thousands of workers, when architects need to measure angles and volumes. But the tablet is dated to 2000 BCE, and it shows no signs of being innovative or experimental. It is presenting standard procedures, teaching methods already established, copying from earlier exemplars that themselves were copies of older sources. Where did the system originate? No one knows. The earliest mathematical tablets we possess already use base 60 fluently, already assume students understand positional notation, where the placement of a symbol determines its value, already expect familiarity with fractions, reciprocals, and geometric series. There is no tablet that says, let us try counting in groups of 60 instead of 10. No record of debate about which numerical base works best. No evidence of transition from one system to another. Base 60 simply exists, used from the earliest periods with the same competence that appears in later texts. And it is a brilliant choice. 60 has more divisors than any smaller number. It can be evenly divided by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, 30. This makes it extraordinarily practical for commerce, construction, and astronomy. Dividing a circle into 360 degrees, 60 times 6, allows for clean subdivision into halves, thirds, quarters, fifths, sixths, and twelfths, all without fractions, all with whole number angles. For celestial observation, this is invaluable. The sky appears as a sphere surrounding Earth. To map it, you need a coordinate system. Base 60 provides one that works elegantly with both spatial measurement and time. Which brings us to the astronomical tablets. In the Louvre Museum, tablet AO6478 contains observations of Venus spanning 21 years. The text records when Venus appeared in the east before sunrise, when it disappeared in the west after sunset, how many days passed between appearances. The observations are meticulous, day counts accurate to within a single day. Positions described relative to specific constellations. This is not casual stargazing. This is systematic data collection. Multiple observers across decades, recording in a standardized format, compiling information that would eventually allow prediction of future positions. The tablet is from the Old Babylonian period, around 1600 BCE, but it claims to be copying older Sumerian observations. The colophon at the end states from the series of Enuma, Anu, Enlil. Enuma, Anu, Enlil was a massive compendium of astronomical omens and observations, over 70 tablets when complete, compiled over centuries, tracing back to Sumerian sources that have since been lost. How far back? We cannot know, but the observations in AO6478 track Venus with precision that requires understanding its synodic period, 584 days from one heliacal rising to the next. To discover this period, you must observe Venus consistently for years, recognize the pattern, verify it through multiple cycles, then encode it into tables that allow prediction. This is not one generation's work, this is institutional knowledge, temple astronomers passing observations to their successors, each generation adding data, each one refining the model. But the earliest tablets already have the period correct, already predict Venus positions with accuracy, as though the hard work of discovery had already been done before the tablets were written. Another tablet, VAT 4924 from the Berlin Museum, tracks Jupiter. It records the planet's synodic period as 39.8 days. Modern calculations give 39.8, 88 days. The error is less than 1 day. Achieved without telescopes, without modern timekeeping, using only naked eye observation and careful record keeping. Saturn appears in other texts with a synodic period of 378 days. Modern value, 378.09 days. Mars, 780 days. Modern value, 779.94 days. These are not approximations. These are precise measurements that match reality to within fractions of a percent, and all of them appear in tablets that claim to be copying older sources, from the ancient series, from distant days, from times before memory. The most striking astronomical text is the Mul, Apin, a compendium of celestial knowledge compiled around 1000 BCE, but containing much older Sumerian material. Mul, Apin lists stars and constellations, describes their rising and setting times throughout the year, provides formulas for calculating the length of daylight in different seasons. But it also contains something stranger, references to precession. Precession is the slow wobble of Earth's axis. It takes approximately 25,920 years to complete one full cycle. During this cycle, the North Celestial Pole traces a circle through the stars. Different stars become the pole star at different epochs. The effect is subtle. In a human lifetime, precession shifts the stars by less than half a degree, but over centuries the shift becomes noticeable. Constellations that once rose at the spring equinox no longer do. The zodiacal signs slowly drift out of alignment with the seasons. To observe precession requires multi-generational record-keeping. Astronomers in one era recording star positions, their descendants centuries later comparing those positions to current observations, recognizing the drift, calculating the rate. The Greeks are credited with discovering precession around 130 BCE, when Hipparchus noticed discrepancies between ancient star catalogues and his own observations. But Appin contains corrections that only make sense if its compilers knew about precession. Adjustments to rising times. Notes that certain stars no longer align with seasonal markers the way they once did. The Sumerians may not have understood the mechanism. They did not know Earth's axis wobbles, but they recognized the effect. They documented the shift, which means they had access to astronomical records spanning not just decades or centuries, but millennia. From where, from whom, the tablets do not say, they simply present the data, copy the observations, preserve the knowledge without explaining its origin. One tablet from Uruk, dated to approximately 3000 BCE, contains a star map, constellations drawn with geometric precision, positions marked relative to the ecliptic, the path the sun traces through the sky. The map includes stars we still recognize: the bull, the lion, the scorpion. But their positions do not match the sky as it appeared in 3000 BCE. When astronomers reconstructed the ancient sky using computer models, they found the map matches star positions from approximately 10,500 BCE, 12,000 years ago, when the Ice Age was ending, when mammoths still roamed, when humans, according to conventional archaeology, were hunter-gatherers with no settled civilization. Yet someone was mapping stars. And that map was preserved, copied, transmitted through millennia until it was pressed into clay by a Sumerian scribe who may not have understood what he was recording but knew it was important enough to preserve. This is the pattern across Sumerian astronomical texts: precision without explanation, knowledge without developmental history, data that appears complete from the earliest examples, as though the Sumerians inherited an astronomical tradition already mature, already sophisticated, already capable of tracking planetary cycles, mapping constellations, and recognizing patterns that require centuries of observation to detect. They did not discover the heavens. They remembered them. And they encoded that memory into clay, into mathematics, into the base 60 system that allowed them to subdivide circles and calculate time with a precision we still use today. Every time you check a clock and see 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, you are using Sumerian mathematics. Every time you measure an angle in degrees, dividing the circle into 360 parts, you are applying knowledge the Sumerians claimed was given to them from distant days. Knowledge they preserved, knowledge they transmitted, knowledge they insisted was not their invention but their inheritance. Dr. Claude. Samuel Noah Kramer spent 5 decades translating Sumerian tablets. His office at the University of Pennsylvania was lined with index cards, each one containing a Sumerian word, a grammatical form, a fragment of translated text. He called Sumerian history's first recorded civilization. But he also called it history's most mysterious. In his 1956 book, History Begins at Sumer, Kramer catalogued 39 firsts attributed to Sumerian civilization: the first schools, the first law codes, the first pharmacopoeia, the first farmer's almanac, the first library catalogue, the first moral ideals, the first parliament. But as he continued his work, translating thousands of tablets over his career, Kramer began to notice something that troubled him. The Sumerians themselves never claimed these firsts. They consistently attributed their knowledge to earlier sources, to divine teaching, to restoration of what had been before. In his later writings, Kramer acknowledged this contradiction. He wrote that Sumerian civilization appeared with surprising suddenness, that the language showed no evolutionary development, that the sophistication of early texts suggested inheritance rather than invention. He stopped short of proposing a pre-Sumerian advanced civilization. The evidence he felt was insufficient, but he acknowledged the mystery remained unsolved. Dr. Kocht. Bent Alster, professor of Assyriology at the University of Copenhagen, studied Sumerian literary texts for 4 decades. In his analysis of the instructions of Shuruppak, one of the oldest wisdom texts, he noted something peculiar. The text presents itself as advice from a father to his son, practical guidance on ethics, commerce, and social interaction. But the language is archaic, more archaic than text from the same period. Auster concluded the instructions of Shuruppak was not composed during the early dynastic period when it was written down. It was copied from much older oral traditions that may have predated the flood. The name Shuruppak itself is significant. This is the city where Ziusudra ruled before the deluge, the city buried beneath the flood layer that Leonard Woolley discovered. So, the wisdom literature attributed to Shuruppak may preserve actual pre-flood knowledge, ethics and social practices transmitted orally through the catastrophe, then finally recorded in writing centuries after the waters receded. Dr. Thorkild Jacobsen, another giant of Sumerology, took a different approach. He analyzed Sumerian religious texts as historical documents, not literal history, but encoded memory. In his book, The Treasures of Darkness, Jacobsen argued that Sumerian gods represented real historical processes. Enki, god of wisdom and water, embodied the development of irrigation. Enlil, god of storms and agriculture, represented the unpredictable power of weather. But Jacobsen also noted that Sumerian theology presented these gods as teachers, beings who came from elsewhere and instructed humanity in specific skills. He wrote that this pattern, repeated across cultures worldwide, suggests a common memory, perhaps of cultural diffusion, perhaps of knowledge transmission from advanced groups to less advanced populations. Jacobsen did not speculate on who those advanced groups might have been, but he acknowledged the global similarity of flood myths. Teacher-god narratives and claims of knowledge descending from heaven suggested something more than independent invention. Dr. Toman. Jeremy Black, who directed the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature at Oxford, approached the question from a linguistic angle. In his analysis of Sumerian grammar, Black noted anomalies that suggested substrate influence, certain grammatical structures that did not fit the agglutinative pattern Sumerian normally follows, phonetic quirks inconsistent with the rest of the language. These anomalies, Black proposed, were fossils, remnants of an earlier language that had influenced Sumerian during its formation, a substrate tongue now lost, leaving only traces in grammatical irregularities. If Sumerian absorbed elements from an earlier language, where did that language come from? Who spoke it? And what happened to them? Black could not answer. The evidence was too fragmentary. But he maintained that Sumerian did not develop in isolation. It showed signs of contact with something older. Contemporary researchers have taken more controversial positions. Dr. Robert Schoch, a geologist from Boston University, is best known for his work on the Sphinx in Egypt. He proposed that water erosion patterns on the Sphinx enclosure indicate the monument predates conventional chronology by thousands of years. Schoch has also examined Mesopotamian sites. He notes that geological evidence supports catastrophic flooding in southern Iraq around 2900 BCE. He argues this was not a local event but part of a global pattern of climate disruption following the end of the Ice Age. If advanced coastal civilizations existed during the Ice Age and were drowned by rising sea levels, Schoch suggests their survivors would have fled inland carrying knowledge with them. That knowledge would appear in later civilizations as sudden sophistication, as inherited wisdom, as claims that civilization was given rather than developed. Mainstream archaeology rejects this hypothesis. There is no direct evidence of Ice Age civilizations with Sumerian-level sophistication. The absence of artifacts, the lack of ruins, the complete disappearance of material culture makes the theory, in their view, speculative at best. But Schoch counters that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. If settlements existed on coastlines now submerged beneath hundreds of feet of seawater, we would have no way to excavate them without massive underwater archaeological expeditions. And those expeditions, when they have occurred, have found anomalies. Submerged structures off the coast of India, underwater ruins near Japan, stone formations beneath the Mediterranean that appear too regular to be natural. None of these findings prove the existence of a pre-Sumerian advanced civilization, but they create space for the possibility. Dr. Giorgio Buxalati, Professor Emeritus at UCLA and Director of Excavations at Ancient Urkesh, takes a middle position. He argues that the Sumerians were indeed innovators. They developed writing. They created the first cities, they established the foundations of civilization. But Buxalati also acknowledges that the Sumerians built upon earlier traditions. The Ubaid culture that preceded them showed proto-urban tendencies. The Halaf culture before that demonstrated sophisticated pottery and trade networks. The question is not whether the Sumerians invented everything from scratch, but how much they inherited and from how far back the chain of inheritance extends. Bukalathi suggests the answer may lie in the concept of cultural accumulation. Knowledge builds slowly across millennia. Each generation adds a small increment. Most progress is lost in catastrophes, conflicts, and cultural disruptions, but fragments survive. The Sumerians may have been the first to write things down comprehensively, but what they wrote was not purely their own invention. It was the accumulated wisdom of countless generations stretching back into the unrecorded past. This explanation accounts for the sophistication without requiring a lost advanced civilization. It allows for inheritance without invoking mystery, but it struggles to explain the precision. The base 60 mathematics appear incomplete, the astronomical observations requiring centuries of data collection, the architectural knowledge demonstrated in the earliest temples. If knowledge accumulated slowly, we should see the accumulation. Failed experiments. Gradual refinement. The archaeological signature of trial and error. We see none of that. We see competence from the start. Which brings us back to the question every scholar eventually confronts. Were the Sumerians first? Or were they, as they claimed, the restorers of what was before? Dawn at Eridu. The air is cool, carrying the scent of desert and dust. The horizon glows pale yellow where the sun has not yet risen, and from the sand, like a wound in the earth, the excavation pit descends into darkness. Stand at the edge and look down. The walls of the trench show layers, each one a different color, a different texture. Near the surface, loose sand mixed with modern debris, deeper compacted soil containing Islamic period pottery, deeper still, grey clay marking the Babylonian era, and at the bottom, 30 feet below the desert floor, the oldest temple platform. Mud brick walls barely 3 feet high, a simple rectangular structure with an altar at the eastern end. This is Temple 1, dated to 5000 BCE, 7,000 years old. From this spot, looking east across the ruins, you can trace the history of Eridu in architecture. Temple 2 was built directly above Temple 1, larger and more elaborate. Temple 3 added side chambers. Temple 4 introduced buttress walls, each one sitting exactly above the last, each one oriented the same direction, each one honoring the same god, Enki, keeper of the Apsu, the sweet waters beneath the earth. By Temple 18, the uppermost structure, the sacred platform, had grown into a ziggurat, massive stepped pyramid dominating the landscape, visible for miles across the flat alluvial plain. But all of it, from smallest shrine to greatest ziggurat, built on the same sacred spot, as though the location itself held power that transcended any individual structure. Walk now to 12 miles northeast. The ziggurat here has been reconstructed, its lowest tier rebuilt using original bricks. 3 levels ascending toward the sky. External staircases climbing the southern face, each step worn smooth by thousands of pilgrims who ascended to worship Nana, the moon god. At the summit, nothing remains of the temple that once crowned the structure. Only the platform, open to the sky, empty. But stand here at sunset and watch the light change. The desert turns gold, the shadows lengthen, and for a moment you can imagine how it looked when the shrine still stood, when priests performed rituals at the sacred height, when the ziggurat was not a ruin but a living connection between earth and heaven. The ziggurat at was built by Namu around 2100 BCE, but excavations beneath it reveal earlier platforms. Older construction. Foundation stones that predate Namu by centuries. He did not invent the ziggurat. He rebuilt it, restored it, made it higher, grander, more permanent. But the idea, the concept of a sacred mountain built of brick was already ancient in his time. Travel north to Uruk. The site is vast, over 1,000 acres of ruins spread across the desert. City walls stretching for miles, though most have eroded into low mounds of earth. The White Temple sits atop the Anu Ziggurat, a platform 40 feet high. The temple itself is small, single central hall with an altar. But its position, elevated above the city, made it the visual and spiritual center of Uruk. From here, at the temple summit, you can see the entire ancient city, residential districts, craft workshops, administrative buildings, and in the distance, the Yana precinct temple complex dedicated to Inanna. Uruk in its prime held perhaps 80,000 people. the largest city on Earth in 3000 BCE, a center of trade, culture, and political power. But walk through the ruins now and all you find is silence. Broken pottery, eroded brick, shadows where walls once stood. The ziggurat itself is crumbling. Each winter rain, rare as it is, washes away more of the ancient structure. Each summer, the heat causes bricks to crack and flake. Slowly, inevitably, the ziggurat returns to the desert from which it was built. At Nippur, 100 miles north of Ur, the sacred precinct holds the ruins of the Ekur temple of Enlil. This was the religious center of Sumer, the place where kings came to receive legitimacy, where priests maintained the calendar, where scribes copied the most sacred texts. The ziggurat at Nippur was never the tallest, but it was the most important, because Enlil was king of the gods, and Nippur was his city. Excavations here have yielded over 50,000 tablets, more than any other Sumerian site. Mathematical texts, literary works, religious hymns, administrative records documenting every aspect of temple life. And buried beneath later construction, archaeologists found the oldest layer, a sacred precinct dating to the early dynastic period. Simple shrines, offering tables, evidence of ritual activity stretching back to the beginning of Sumerian civilization. Nippur was never abandoned. For over 3,000 years, from the early dynastic period through the Babylonian era and into the Parthian period, the city maintained continuous occupation. The ziggurat was rebuilt multiple times, each king adding to the work of his predecessors, each generation maintaining the sacred height, until finally, sometime in the early centuries CE, the last rituals were performed, the last priests departed, and the ziggurat stood empty, slowly surrendering to wind and time. Walk through these ruins now and the silence is overwhelming. The desert has reclaimed what humanity built. Sand fills the courtyards, walls collapse into rubble, the ziggurats erode into shapeless mounds. But the geometry remains. The alignments persist. The foundation stones, too massive to move, still mark the cardinal directions with impossible precision. These were not random constructions, these were deliberate acts of memory. Each ziggurat a monument to knowledge that transcended its builders, each one reaching towards something no longer accessible but never forgotten. If we trust the Sumerian king list, if we read it not as mythology but as encoded chronology, then the timeline of human civilization looks very different from what we have been taught. Before the flood, the 8 kings reigned for a total of 200 and 400 years. Impossible lifespans measured in units of Sar, 3,600-year cycles that may represent astronomical epochs rather than individual lives. This would place the beginning of their rule at approximately 200 and 400 BCE, during the last ice age. When glaciers covered Europe and sea levels were 400 feet lower than today, the Persian Gulf did not exist as a body of water, it was a river valley. The Tigris and Euphrates joined and flowed through it, creating a fertile lowland perfect for settlement. If humans lived there, built cities there, developed civilization there, every trace now rests beneath the ocean. Then came the flood. Not the catastrophic inundation of 2900 BCE, which the tablets describe, but the much larger event of 12,000 to 10,000 BCE when the Ice Age ended and the seas rose worldwide. Coastlines drowned, river valleys became bays, islands vanished. Any civilization dependent on coastal resources or lowland agriculture would have been devastated. Survivors fled inland. They carried what they could: knowledge, seeds, tools, stories. And they settled in the few places where water remained predictable and land stayed dry. One of those places was southern Mesopotamia, high enough to avoid flooding, fed by rivers that flowed year-round, fertile enough to support agriculture. Here the refugees rebuilt, slowly at first, scattered settlements, small shrines, careful preservation of what knowledge remained. By 5000 BCE, Temple 1 at Eridu was constructed, already showing architectural sophistication, already aligned to celestial events, already part of a tradition that understood building, astronomy, and sacred space. By 3500 BCE, cities appeared. Uruk, Eridu, Ur, urban centers with populations in the thousands. Ziggurat platforms rising from the desert, writing beginning to develop. This is when the Sumerians enter the historical record. But they do not enter as primitives learning to organize. They enter already competent, already literate, already building monuments that require advanced mathematics. Then in 2900 BCE, catastrophe struck again. Not the end of an ice age, but a massive regional flood. Storm surge from the Persian Gulf. Catastrophic river overflow. The compound disaster that deposited meters of sterile silt across every Sumerian city. The king list marks this moment with a single line. Then the flood swept over. After that, everything changed. The pre-flood kings with their impossible reigns gave way to mortal rulers. Kingship was lowered from heaven again, the text says, but lowered to humans, not to beings who could reign for tens of thousands of years. The age of gods ended. The age of men began. Or perhaps what ended was the direct transmission of knowledge. Perhaps the flood killed the last teachers. The last Anunnaki, the last keepers of the complete system. What survived were fragments, tablets, rituals, mathematical formulas whose derivations were no longer understood but whose results could still be applied. The Sumerians spent the next 500 years, from 2900 to 1400 BCE, preserving these fragments, copying tablets, rebuilding ziggurats, maintaining astronomical observations, teaching the scribal arts in schools. They knew they were the inheritors of something greater. They knew their knowledge came from before, from distant days, from the world that drowned, and they encoded that knowledge everywhere, in base 60 mathematics, in star charts, in architectural alignments, in the king list itself, which preserved impossible numbers because to change them would be to forget what they represented. By 1400 BCE, Sumerian was no longer spoken. It survived only as a liturgical language. Priests recited hymns in Sumerian. Scribes copied Sumerian texts. But no children learned it as their first tongue. The language became fossil. The knowledge became tradition. And slowly, inevitably, understanding faded. The ziggurats still stood. But fewer priests knew why they had been built. The astronomical tablets were still copied. But fewer scribes understood the observations they contained. Memory became ritual, became habit, became archaeology, until finally, by the early century CE, the last rites were performed, the last tablets copied, and Mesopotamian civilization, which had endured for 5,000 years, fell silent. The desert reclaimed the cities, sand buried the ziggurats, and for 2,000 years the ruins waited. When modern archaeologists arrived in the 1800s, they expected to find the beginning of civilization. What they found instead was the end. The end of a knowledge tradition that had survived multiple catastrophes. The end of a cultural memory stretching back to the Ice Age and perhaps beyond. The end of humanity's first recorded attempt to preserve what the flood had nearly destroyed. The Sumerians were not the first. They said so themselves. In clay, in stone, in the careful geometry of their cities. They were the restorers, the preservers, the last custodians of knowledge given from heaven, transmitted through catastrophe and pressed into wet clay so it would survive the next deluge. And it did survive. In museums, in tablets, in the base 60 system we still use, in the names of constellations we still recognize. The Sumerians succeeded. They preserved the memory. They carried it across the flood and into history. And now, 5,000 years later, we stand in the ruins they left behind and ask the same question they asked. What came before? What knowledge did we lose? And can we, like them, preserve enough fragments to remember? In southeastern Turkey, on a limestone ridge overlooking the Mesopotamian plain, something impossible rises from the earth. Göbekli Tepe, Potbelly Hill in Turkish, a name that reveals nothing about what lies beneath. When German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt first visited the site in 1994, he expected nothing remarkable. The hill had been surveyed before. Previous researchers dismissed it as a medieval cemetery, just another abandoned graveyard in a region filled with ancient ruins. But Schmidt saw something they had missed. Stone fragments protruding from the soil. Not ordinary rocks, worked stone, carved stone. Limestone pillars shaped with tools and intention. He began excavating. And what emerged rewrote everything we thought we knew about the origins of civilization. Göbekli Tepe is a temple complex, massive stone circles arranged in a pattern that spans over 20 acres. Each circle consists of 2 central pillars surrounded by smaller megaliths. The pillars are T-shaped, carved from single blocks of limestone weighing up to 20 tons. They stand 15 feet tall, their surfaces covered with intricate reliefs. Animals emerge from the stone, Foxes, lions, scorpions, vultures, serpents, carved with such skill that you can see individual feathers on the birds, individual scales on the snakes. This is not primitive art. This is the work of master craftsmen who understood anatomy, proportion, and how to make stone breathe. But here is what makes Göbekli Tepe impossible. It dates to 9500 BCE, 11,500 years ago, 3,000 years before Sumerian cities, 6,000 years before the pyramids, 7,000 years before Stonehenge. At that time, according to every model of human development, people were hunter-gatherers. They lived in small bands, they followed game, they had no settled agriculture, no domesticated animals, no reason or ability to construct monuments. Yet Göbekli Tepe exists. And it is not a crude first attempt, it is sophisticated from the beginning. The earliest circles, the deepest layers, show the most skill. Later construction is actually less impressive, as though the knowledge that built the first temples was already fading by the time the later ones were raised. This is the opposite of what should happen. Technology is supposed to improve over time. Skills should accumulate. But at Göbekli Tepe, the progression runs backward. The site was deliberately buried around 8000 BCE. The circles were filled with rubble and soil, carefully, methodically, as though preserving them for a future that might understand what they meant. Schmidt spent 20 years excavating Göbekli Tepe before his death in 2014. He never finished. Ground-penetrating radar suggests at least 20 more circles remain beneath the soil, each one waiting, each one silent. And across the region, similar sites have been discovered. Karahan Tepe, Navali Kori, Harbetsevan Tepe, all dating to the same impossible era, all showing the same inexplicable sophistication. These were not isolated experiments. This was a culture, a civilization that built in stone before agriculture existed, before pottery was invented, before the settled world we recognize. Who were they? Where did their knowledge come from, and what happened to them? The stones do not answer. They only pose the question in limestone and silence. But the parallels to Sumer are undeniable. Both cultures appeared with knowledge already mature. Both built monuments aligned to celestial events. Both showed no developmental stages, no fumbling beginnings. And both preserved stories of a world before. A golden age when gods walked among humans, when knowledge flowed freely, when the boundary between mortal and divine was thinner than breath. Göbekli Tepe was abandoned before the Sumerians built their first city. But perhaps the people who built it did not vanish. Perhaps they migrated south when climate shifted and rainfall patterns changed. Perhaps they carried their knowledge to the river valleys where water remained predictable. Perhaps they became the teachers the Sumerians remembered, the Anunnaki. Those who from heaven to earth came. In Egypt, on the Giza Plateau, 3 pyramids rise from desert sand. They have stood for 4,500 years, outlasted empires, survived earthquakes, watched civilizations bloom and collapse into dust. The largest, the Great Pyramid of Khufu, is a mountain of precision. 3 million stone blocks, some weighing 80 tons, fitted together so tightly that a knife blade cannot slip between them. Aligned to true north with an accuracy of 3 arc minutes, less than 1/20th of a single degree. For centuries, we believed we understood this monument. A tomb built by Pharaoh Khufu around 2560 BCE, a monument to ego and power, the triumph of human labor over impossible odds. But the deeper we look, the stranger it becomes. The Great Pyramid encodes mathematical constants that should not exist in 2560 BCE. The ratio of its height to the perimeter of its base is exactly 2 pi, the same ratio that defines a circle, as though the pyramid were a squared circle, geometry made solid. Multiply the pyramid's height by 40,200 and you get the polar radius of Earth. Multiply the base perimeter by the same number and you get Earth's equatorial circumference. 40,200 is not random, it is 1/6 of the precession cycle, the 25,920-year wobble of Earth's axis. A number the ancient world tracked through astronomical observation. How could pyramid builders in 2560 BCE know Earth's dimensions? They had no satellites, no global surveys, no way to measure the planet's radius unless they inherited the knowledge from someone who did. Inside the pyramid, the king's chamber is built entirely from red Aswan granite. The stone contains high concentrations of quartz crystal. When subjected to pressure, quartz generates electrical charge. The immense weight of the pyramid pressing down on those granite blocks would create a constant piezoelectric effect. The chamber resonates at 110 Hz, the exact frequency that affects human consciousness. Modern neuroscience has shown that sound at 110 Hz alters brainwave activity, inducing states associated with meditation and trance. Was the king's chamber designed as a tomb, or as something else entirely? The shafts extending from the queen's chamber point to specific stars, Sirius in the south, Thuban, the ancient pole star, in the north. Not approximate alignments, exact trajectories calculated with astronomical precision. And beneath the pyramid, ground-penetrating radar has detected voids, chambers that do not appear on any architectural plan. Space is sealed since construction, their contents unknown. The Egyptian pyramids, like Sumerian ziggurats, were not built in isolation. They appear as part of a sudden flourishing. The Old Kingdom emerges around 2700 BCE with architectural knowledge already mature. The Pyramid of Djoser, the first step pyramid, shows competence. The bent pyramid demonstrates experimentation. But by Khufu's reign, barely 100 years later, the knowledge has reached perfection. Then it fades. Later pyramids are smaller, cruder, less precise. The knowledge peaks and then declines as though something essential was lost. The pattern mirrors Sumer, mirrors Göbekli Tepe, knowledge arriving complete, enduring for a time, then fading as memory fails and the last teachers die. Egyptian texts, like Sumerian tablets, speak of a world before. The Zep Tepi, the first time when gods ruled Egypt directly. When Thoth gave writing, when Osiris taught agriculture, when divine knowledge flowed freely before chaos and disorder disrupted the cosmic balance. The Egyptians did not claim to invent their civilization. They claimed to restore it, to rebuild what the gods had established in the beginning and what time had eroded. The same language, the same memory. Preservation, not creation. Stand back far enough and the pattern becomes visible. Not in any single site, but in the constellation of anomalies scattered across the ancient world. In India, the city of Mohenjo-Daro shows urban planning that rivals modern design. Grid layouts, standardized brick sizes, sophisticated drainage systems, all dating to 2500 BCE. And beneath the city, older layers suggest occupation stretching back millennia before the Indus Valley civilization entered history. In Peru, the ruins of Tiwanaku sit at 12,500 feet above sea level. Stone blocks weighing hundreds of tons, fitted with precision that defies copper and bronze tools. Aligned to astronomical events with mathematical accuracy. Dating to periods when Andean cultures supposedly lacked the organization for monumental construction. In Japan, submerged ruins off Yonaguni Island show massive stone terraces, angular cuts, and geometric formations that appear artificial. They rest beneath 80 feet of water. If they are human-made, they date to at least 10,000 BCE, when sea levels were lower and the coastline exposed what is now underwater. On Malta, the hypogeum of Sal Saflieni descends 3 levels into bedrock. Carved chambers. Acoustic resonance tuned to specific frequencies, dating to 3600 BCE. Built by a culture that left no written records but demonstrated advanced understanding of sound and sacred space. In Lebanon, the Temple of Jupiter at Baalbek rests on a foundation of megalithic stones. The trilithon, 3 blocks each weighing approximately 800 tons. Fitted together with such precision that modern engineers struggle to explain how they were moved, much less lifted into place. Different continents, different cultures, different time periods, yet the same signatures appear. Sudden sophistication. Monuments requiring knowledge that should not exist. Astronomical alignments demanding multi-generational observation. Mathematical precision suggesting inherited formulas rather than discovered principles. And everywhere, the same stories. A golden age before catastrophe. Teachers from elsewhere who brought knowledge. A flood that divided history into before and after. These are not coincidences. The details vary, but the structure remains constant. The narrative is too similar, too widespread, to be independent invention. Something happened in humanity's deep past. Something that left echoes in every culture that survived to tell the story. Perhaps it was the end of the Ice Age, when glaciers melted and seas rose and coastlines drowned. when any civilization dependent on lowland agriculture or coastal resources would have been devastated. Perhaps survivors scattered, carrying fragments of knowledge, settling wherever water remained and land stayed dry, teaching what they could remember to populations who had lost everything. Perhaps that is why advanced knowledge appears suddenly in so many places. Not because each culture independently invented writing, mathematics, astronomy, and monumental architecture, but because refugees from a drowned world carried that knowledge with them and seeded it in the civilizations that would follow. We call it the Neolithic Revolution. The sudden shift from hunting and gathering to settled agriculture, the rapid development of cities, writing, and complex societies. But revolutions are driven by new ideas, and these ideas appeared complete, fully formed, already sophisticated. Perhaps what we call revolution was really restoration, the rebuilding of what had been lost, the recovery of knowledge that had survived the flood in fragments and was being pieced back together by survivors who remembered enough to begin again. If this is true, if the evidence points toward a lost civilization predating Sumer, Egypt, and all the ancient cultures we recognize, then everything we thought we knew about human progress is wrong. Civilization is not linear, it is cyclical. It rises, flourishes, and collapses. Knowledge accumulates, reaches a peak, and then is lost when catastrophe strikes. The Sumerians knew this. That is why they wrote so obsessively, why they copied tablets across centuries, why they preserved a dead language for 2,000 years after it stopped being spoken. They understood that knowledge is fragile, that catastrophe comes, that memory fades, and they built monuments designed to outlast collapse. Ziggurats that would stand when cities fell, tablets that would survive when libraries burned. Mathematical systems so useful they would be transmitted even when their origins were forgotten. They succeeded. We still use base 60, we still divide circles into 360 degrees, we still recognize the constellations they named, but we forgot why. We forgot that these were not inventions but inheritances, gifts from a world before the flood. Now, as our own civilization faces potential collapse through climate change, nuclear weapons, or technological disruption, the Sumerian example becomes urgent. What are we preserving? What knowledge are we encoding in forms durable enough to survive catastrophe? If our cities drown, our servers fail, our books decay, what will remain? Perhaps future archaeologists will excavate our ruins the way we excavated Sumer. They will marvel at our sophistication. They will wonder how we knew so much, and perhaps they will find, carved into whatever monuments we leave behind, the same message the Sumerians left for us. This is the restoration of what was before. The wind passes over the desert before dawn. It carries dust that may have once been temples. Beneath that dust, beneath the ruins, memory waits. Memory pressed into clay, memory carved into stone, memory encoded in myths that outlasted empires. The Sumerians called it restoration, not invention, restoration. The recovery of what was before, not the creation of something new. And if that is true, everything changes. Because we have been taught that history moves forward, that humanity climbs from darkness toward light, that each generation knows more than the last. Progress, we call it. The steady march from primitive to advanced, from ignorance to understanding. But what if history does not march? What if it circles? What if knowledge rises and falls like tides, accumulating during ages of peace, then washing away when catastrophe comes? The clay tablets whisper this possibility. They say knowledge was given. They say civilization descended from heaven. They say the world before the flood was not primitive, but advanced. Not the beginning, but the ending of something older. We have spent centuries dismissing these claims as mythology, as the imaginative stories of people who could not explain their own existence, but the evidence keeps accumulating. The flood layers are real. The astronomical precision is undeniable. The mathematical sophistication appears without developmental stages. The language stands alone with no ancestral roots, and the pattern repeats globally. Different continents, different millennia. Same story. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, built 11,500 years ago by people who should not have possessed such knowledge. The Great Pyramid in Egypt, encoding Earth's dimensions in stone. Submerged ruins off coastlines worldwide, drowned when the Ice Age ended. All pointing to the same conclusion. Something came before, something was lost, something was remembered. Sit with that idea for a moment, let it settle. Imagine the world 12,000 years ago. the Ice Age ending, glaciers melting, seas rising 400 feet, coastlines drowning. Any civilization built near water would have been erased. Any knowledge stored in perishable materials would have decayed. Any language spoken only, never written, would have vanished with its speakers. All that would remain are fragments, stone monuments too massive to move, oral traditions passed through generations, mathematical formulas useful enough to preserve even when their origins were forgotten, and survivors, people who fled the rising waters, who carried what they could, who settled in the few places where land stayed dry, the river valleys of Mesopotamia, the highlands of Anatolia, the plateaus of Egypt and Peru, wherever water remained predictable and catastrophe had not reached. These survivors would have rebuilt, slowly at first, small shrines, careful agriculture, the gradual reorganization of shattered communities, but they would have carried something invisible with them. Memory, the knowledge that their world had ended before, the understanding that stability is temporary, the awareness that what seems permanent can vanish overnight, and so they built differently. Not for comfort alone, but for endurance. Not for a single generation, but for eternity. They pressed their knowledge into clay because clay survives fire. They carved their monuments from stone because stone outlasts wood and brick. They encoded their wisdom into mathematics because numbers transcend language. They aligned their temples to the stars because the stars remain constant even when empires fall. This was not superstition. This was strategy. The deliberate choice to preserve what mattered most in forms that could survive the next catastrophe. And it worked. 5,000 years after the Sumerians wrote their last tablet, we can still read their words. 7,000 years after Göbekli Tepe was buried, we have uncovered its circles. 11,000 years after the Ice Age ended, we are finding submerged ruins that prove cities existed on coastlines now underwater. The preservation succeeded, the memory survived, but we forgot to remember why. We treat these monuments as relics of the past, dead cultures, extinct languages, mysteries without relevance. But perhaps they are not relics, perhaps they are warnings. The Sumerians knew catastrophe comes, they experienced it. The flood that divided their history into before and after was not mythology, it was trauma, real water, real loss. Real survivors trying desperately to preserve what the deluge had nearly destroyed. And their message, encoded in every tablet, every ziggurat, every mathematical formula, is simple. Remember. Remember that civilization is fragile. Remember that knowledge can be lost. Remember that what seems impossible, the drowning of the world, has happened before, and it will happen again, not the same way, not the same flood, but catastrophe in some form. Climate shifts, technological collapse, war, pandemic, or something we have not yet imagined. The Sumerians could not have predicted our specific challenges, but they understood the pattern. They knew that every age believes itself permanent, every civilization thinks it will last forever, and everyone eventually falls. What endures is not the civilization itself, but what it chooses to preserve. So the question becomes urgent. What are we preserving? Our knowledge exists on servers that require constant power, in books that decay in decades, in languages that evolve so rapidly that texts from centuries ago require translation. If the power fails, most of what we know becomes inaccessible. If the libraries burn, our history disappears. If our languages fragment, future generations will struggle to read what we wrote. The Sumerians solved this problem. Clay tablets do not need electricity. Base 60 mathematics works with or without computers. Stone monuments stand regardless of political systems. They built for collapse. They encoded for catastrophe. They preserved with the understanding that those who came after might live in a very different world. And we, standing in their ruins, benefit from that foresight. We can read their tablets, we can measure their monuments, we can decode their mathematics. Because they chose durability over convenience, permanence over efficiency. Perhaps we should do the same. Not abandoning modern technology, but supplementing it. Encoding essential knowledge in forms that do not require infrastructure. Building monuments that communicate through geometry rather than words. Preserving languages even after they stop being spoken. Because if the Sumerians are right, if history truly is cyclical, then our descendants will face the same challenge they did. Rebuilding from fragments. Decoding half-remembered wisdom. trying to understand what their ancestors knew before catastrophe erased the details. We can make that task easier, or we can make it impossible. The choice is ours. But the clock is always running. The desert wind passes over Mesopotamia. The same wind that blew when Eridu was new. The same wind that carried dust from the flood-drowned cities. The same wind that will blow long after our own civilization has faded. And beneath that wind, the ruins wait. Silent, patient, holding their secrets in clay and stone. The Ziggurats stand though their summits have crumbled. The tablets rest behind museum glass. The mathematical formulas persist in systems we use daily without remembering their source. The Sumerians are gone, their language is dead, their cities are dust, but their message endures. This is the restoration of what was before, not the beginning, not the invention. The restoration, the careful, deliberate act of remembering what was lost and encoding it so it would survive. We are the inheritors of that act every time we divide an hour into 60 minutes. Every time we measure an angle in degrees. Every time we track the planets against the stars. We are using Sumerian knowledge. Participating in a tradition that stretches back through millennia. Connecting to minds that lived and died before any empire we recognize. That is not a small thing. That is miracle, not supernatural miracle. But the miracle of transmission, of knowledge passed from hand to hand across impossible distances of time, from teacher to student, from parent to child, from one civilization to its successor. Until finally, 5,000 years after the last Sumerian tablet was written, we stand in museums and read their words, and understand. The cycle continues. Knowledge is lost, knowledge is found, civilizations rise, civilizations fall. But memory, if it is encoded carefully enough, survives the turning. The Sumerians survived the flood, not physically, most of them drowned, but their memory survived, carried by refugees, preserved in oral tradition, eventually pressed into clay. And that clay, patient and durable, waited. Through the fall of Sumer, through the rise of Babylon, through the conquest of Persia, through the campaigns of Alexander, through the rise and fall of Rome, through the Islamic Golden Age, through the Ottoman Empire, through world wars and revolutions, waiting in the earth until someone with the right tools could uncover it, could read it, could understand what it was trying to say. We are that someone. We have the tools, we have the translations, we have the ability to recognize what the Sumerians were doing. The question is whether we have the wisdom to learn from it, to understand that preservation is not weakness but foresight, that encoding knowledge for catastrophe is not pessimism but prudence, that building for eternity is not hubris but humility, the acknowledgement that we are temporary, that our civilization, like all before it, will eventually pass. But what we choose to preserve can outlast us, can carry forward into ages we will never see, can speak to minds we will never know, the way Sumerian tablets speak to us now, across 5,000 years of silence. The wind passes over the desert. Dawn is coming. The horizon lightens from black to grey to pale gold. And in that growing light, the shapes of the ruins become visible, low mounds where cities stood, eroded platforms where ziggurats rose, scattered brick where temples honored forgotten gods, all of it returning to dust, all of it fading into the landscape. But not gone. Not yet. Because we remember, because we excavate, because we translate, because we recognize that these ruins are not dead history but living testimony. The Sumerians are speaking still, in every wedge-pressed mark, in every aligned foundation stone, in every mathematical formula we inherited without knowing its age. They are saying, we were here. We knew things you have forgotten. We survived catastrophe you cannot imagine. And we encoded our survival so you would remember, so you would understand, so you, when your own catastrophe comes, would know that it is possible to endure, to rebuild, to restore what was lost. That is the gift. Not technology, not architecture, not even language or mathematics. The gift is hope, the proof that humanity has fallen before and risen again. That knowledge can be lost and recovered. That civilization can drown and be restored. The Sumerians are the evidence. Their tablets are the testimony, and we, reading them in the 21st century, are the proof that their preservation succeeded. That memory, carefully encoded, can survive anything time throws at it, even flood, even collapse, even 5,000 years of silence. The message crossed that distance. It reached us, and now we must decide what to do with it. The desert waits, the ruins rest in silence, and the question they pose echoes across millennia. What will you preserve? What will you encode for the ages after yours? What message will you press into clay or stone or whatever medium proves most durable? Because catastrophe is coming, it always does. The only choice is whether we face it with the wisdom of those who came before, who understood that survival requires memory, that rebuilding requires knowledge, that restoration requires encoded wisdom capable of crossing the flood. The Sumerians knew, they encoded, they preserved, and their memory survived, and so we return to where we began, to the present moment, wherever you are listening from right now. The past whispers through fragments of clay and stone, but we are here, present, alive, still asking questions, still wondering what came before and what lessons might be waiting in the dust. That capacity to wonder, to seek, to remember what was forgotten, that is what makes us human. If this journey through time resonated with you, take a moment to like this video. Subscribe if you want to explore more mysteries that sleep between history and myth. Your support helps keep these stories alive. And perhaps that is the real message hidden in those ancient tablets. Not just what happened, but that someone cared enough to write it down, to preserve it, to send it forward through time to us. We do the same now, in our own way, remembering, questioning, sharing. Thank you for listening, thank you for wondering with me. Until the next mystery calls us back into the past, may your present be peaceful, may your questions lead you somewhere meaningful, and may you rest well, knowing the story continues. The wind passes over the ruins one last time, and memory, patient as stone, waits for the next person brave enough to ask, what if the Ziggurats were never truly built by the Sumerians alone, but restored from something far older? What if we are all restorers, not inventors? What if remembering is the most sacred work we do? The name appears in thousands of tablets, etched into cylinder seals, invoked in royal inscriptions, carved into temple walls that still stand in the Iraqi desert. Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came. For modern readers, the term carries baggage. Decades of speculation, ancient astronaut theories, claims of extraterrestrial intervention, debates between skeptics and believers that generate more heat than light. But strip away the modern interpretations. Set aside both the wild speculation and the dismissive academics. Return to the tablets themselves. Read what the Sumerians actually wrote. And something interesting emerges. The Anunnaki were not distant, unknowable cosmic forces. They were not omnipotent creators who spoke worlds into existence. They were not the god of monotheistic tradition, eternal and perfect. They were administrators, judges, teachers, beings with specific names, genealogies and responsibilities, who made mistakes, who grew tired, who argued with each other, who needed help completing their tasks. In the Sumerian cosmology, the Anunnaki functioned as the middle management of creation. They answered to higher gods, Anu and his council, and they worked alongside humanity, teaching, guiding, occasionally intervening. But most importantly, they were described with physical specificity that makes them sound less like spirits and more like people. They wore robes, they ate food, they drank beer, they married, had children, and died, or at least disappeared from the historical record. This is strange for divine beings. Gods in most mythologies transcend physical needs. They exist outside time, beyond death, untouched by mortal limitations. But the Anunnaki were different. They inhabited the world. They lived in temples that required maintenance. They consumed offerings brought by worshippers. They had offspring who intermarried with humans, creating hybrid bloodlines. The Sumerian king list describes this explicitly. Certain early kings are listed as children of divine parents, human mothers, Anunnaki fathers. This blending of mortal and divine bloodlines appears repeatedly in Sumerian genealogies, not as metaphor for royal legitimacy, but as straightforward ancestry, as though the scribes believed these unions actually occurred. And similar patterns appear globally. In Greek mythology, the children of gods and mortals were called demigods, heroes like Hercules, Perseus, Achilles. Beings who possessed strength and abilities beyond normal humans but remained mortal. In Hebrew scripture, Genesis chapter 6 describes the Nephilim, offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men, giants who walked the earth before the flood, beings of mixed divine and human heritage. In Hindu tradition, many royal lineages claim descent from divine ancestors. The Chandravamsha, lunar dynasty, traced ancestry to the moon god Chandra. The Suryavamsha, solar dynasty, descended from Surya, the sun god. Celtic, Norse, and Polynesian mythologies contain similar themes. Divine beings producing offspring with humans, bloodlines that carried both mortal and immortal heritage. Why would cultures separated by oceans and millennia independently generate the same narrative structure? Perhaps because it is not narrative but memory. The distorted, mythologized, but fundamentally grounded recollection of something that actually occurred. If an advanced culture existed before the flood, if they possessed knowledge that seemed magical to less developed populations, if they intermarried with survivors after the catastrophe, they might be remembered exactly this way. As beings who came from elsewhere, who taught essential skills, who were powerful but not omnipotent, who had children with humans before eventually disappearing, the mythology would be the only framework available to encode that memory, the only language capable of expressing what happened when knowledge descended from a source outside the community's understanding. Consider what the Anunnaki supposedly taught. According to the tablets, each one had specific responsibilities. Enki taught irrigation, agriculture, and the healing arts. He showed humans how to control water, how to plant crops in rows, how to prepare medicines from plants. Enlil governed law and social order. He established the concept of justice, of rules that apply equally to all, of consequences for harmful actions. Ninhursag taught animal husbandry and childbirth practices. She showed how to domesticate livestock, how to assist in difficult births, how to care for newborns. Inanna taught warfare and statecraft, how to organize armies, how to fortify cities, how to navigate the complex politics of rival settlements. Utu taught commerce and honest measurement, how to weigh goods fairly, how to calculate fair exchange, how to maintain trust in economic transactions. These are not abstract divine principles, these are practical skills, the foundational technologies of civilization, and they appear suddenly in Sumerian culture, already codified, already understood, already being taught in schools as established knowledge. If the Anunnaki were teachers from a pre-flood culture, survivors who possess knowledge that the catastrophe nearly destroyed, their portrayal in myth makes perfect sense. They would have seemed godlike to populations struggling to rebuild. Their knowledge would have appeared divine in origin because it came from outside the survivors' immediate experience. And when they eventually died, as all mortals do, their legacy would persist in the knowledge they transmitted and the bloodlines they left behind. The hybrid children would carry fragments of that inheritance, not supernatural powers but intelligence, aptitude, perhaps genetic predispositions toward abstract thinking or technological innovation, and those children would become leaders, kings, priests, the educated elite who maintain the knowledge traditions and pass them forward through generations. This interpretation does not require believing in literal gods or ancient astronauts. It only requires accepting that human populations can exist at vastly different technological levels simultaneously. Even today, we see this. Some cultures use smartphones and satellite navigation. Others maintain hunter-gatherer lifestyles with stone tools. If catastrophe struck our modern world, if 99% of humanity perished, the survivors would live at vastly different technological levels depending on what knowledge they retained. Some would have engineers, doctors, scientists capable of maintaining technology. Others would have only oral traditions and basic survival skills. The technological survivors teaching the others would seem almost magical. Their knowledge would be preserved as divine gift, as wisdom descended from elsewhere. After a few generations, the distinction would blur. The teachers would become gods in mythology, their human origins forgotten, their knowledge encoded as divine revelation rather than transferred expertise. This is what may have happened with the Anunnaki. Not gods but teachers, not immortals but knowledge carriers. Survivors of a pre-flood world who passed their understanding forward and were eventually mythologized beyond recognition. The Sumerians preserved this memory more accurately than most, because they wrote it down early, before oral tradition had centuries to distort the details. Their tablets describe the Anunnaki with bureaucratic precision. Names, roles, relationships, all catalogued as though documenting actual people rather than inventing mythology. Perhaps because that is exactly what they were doing. Documenting. Recording. Preserving the names and functions of those who had taught them before memory faded entirely. And if this is true, then every reference to divine teaching across global mythologies takes on new significance. Prometheus bringing fire to humanity. Quetzalcoatl teaching writing and agriculture. Viracocha rebuilding civilization after the flood. The seven sages of Hindu tradition, the Egyptian Neteru establishing law and astronomy, all might be fragments of the same memory. Teachers from a lost world, survivors carrying knowledge across catastrophe. Encoded into mythology because mythology was the only framework capable of preserving their legacy, the Anunnaki, in this reading, become evidence, not of supernatural intervention, but of human survival, of knowledge transmission across the boundary between ages, of civilization restoring itself from fragments with help from those who remembered what had been lost. Among all Sumerian concepts, one stands out for its strangeness and its importance: the me. Often translated as divine decrees or sacred ordinances, the term appears throughout Sumerian literature with a meaning that resists simple definition. The me were not laws in the modern sense, not rules imposed from above. They were something deeper, principles embedded into the fabric of reality itself, codes that govern not just human behavior, but the structure of existence. According to the myths, there were over 100 me, each one representing a different aspect of civilization. Kingship was a me, priesthood was a me. Music, warfare, sexual love, truthfulness, metalworking, writing, decision-making, all me. Even abstract concepts like fear, power, and kindness had their corresponding me. To possess the me was to possess the blueprint of civilization. To control them was to control reality's operating system. The most famous story about the me involves the goddess Inanna. According to the myth, she travels to Eridu, the city of Enki, determined to acquire the me for her own city of Uruk. Enki, keeper of the me, stores them in the Abzu, the primordial waters beneath the earth. He guards them carefully because they are the most precious treasures in creation. But Inanna is clever. She accepts Enki's invitation to a banquet. They drink beer together. Enki becomes drunk, his judgment impaired. And in his intoxicated state, he begins giving Inanna the me, one by one. Over 100 sacred codes transferred from the keeper to the seeker. Inanna loads them into her boat of heaven. She flees Eridu before Enki realizes what he has done. When Enki sobers and discovers his error, he sends servants to retrieve the me. But Inanna has already crossed the boundary. She reaches Uruk. The me cannot be recalled. Civilization has been transferred. Knowledge has been released. The codes that were once centralized in Eridu are now distributed. Modern scholars read this as political allegory. The myth, they suggest, encodes the historical shift of power from Eridu to Uruk, from older cities to newer centers of culture. But the mechanics of the story are interesting. The me are not abstract, they are transferable objects, physical or at least tangible enough to be loaded onto a boat. They can be given, they can be stolen, they can be moved from one location to another. This sounds less like divine revelation and more like technology transfer, like data storage, like encoding knowledge into portable form. What if the me were not metaphysical concepts but actual records? Tablets containing essential information, formulas for metallurgy, star charts for navigation, medical recipes, legal precedents, agricultural calendars, mathematical systems, the kind of knowledge a civilization would need to function, the kind of information that, if lost, would reduce a complex society to scattered survivors struggling to remember how things once worked. If the me were knowledge databases, then the story of Inanna stealing them becomes a historical account. A younger city acquiring the knowledge held by an older center, scribes copying tablets, rituals transferred, expertise migrating as political power shifted. The Sumerians consistently treated the me as something real, not symbolic but actual. Possessions that could be inventoried, protected, and transmitted. Temple records list the me among sacred objects. Kings claim to have received the me from the gods. Priests performed rituals designed to maintain the me's power. This reverence suggests the me were not just ideas but treasures. artifacts too valuable to lose. And if we accept that interpretation, then the Sumerian obsession with preservation makes even more sense. They were not just recording their own achievements, they were maintaining the me, the coded knowledge inherited from before the flood. The essential data required to rebuild civilization if catastrophe struck again. Every tablet copied was an act of preserving the me. Every mathematical formula taught to students, every astronomical observation recorded, every medical recipe documented, all of it was maintaining the system, ensuring the codes did not corrupt, guaranteeing that if knowledge transmission failed in one generation, the next could recover it from clay. The me, in this sense, was civilization's source code, the fundamental programming that made complex society possible. And the Sumerians understood that source code must be backed up, distributed, encoded redundantly across multiple locations and formats. So they wrote, they built, they aligned, they preserved. They created a knowledge system resilient enough to survive flood, war, and the collapse of their own civilization. And it worked. We can still read their tablets, we can still use their mathematics, we can still recognize the me they encoded 5,000 years ago. Kingship, justice, writing, astronomy, all transferred across the ages. All surviving because someone understood that knowledge is too precious to exist in only one form, one language, one location. The me endure. And we, using base 60 time and 360-degree circles, participate in their perpetuation. After 5,000 years of silence, after excavations that span more than a century, after translating hundreds of thousands of tablets and mapping the ruins of dozens of cities, after astronomical calculations and geological surveys and linguistic analysis. After all of this work, one question remains unanswered. Were the Ziggurats truly built by the Sumerians? The archaeological evidence says yes. Sumerian workers constructed these monuments using mud brick and bitumen. Sumerian architects designed the platforms. Sumerian priests performed rituals at their summits. But the tablets themselves suggest something more complex. This is the restoration of what was before, not the invention, the restoration. Which means the Ziggurats, like Sumerian mathematics and astronomy and writing, were not pure innovations. They were reconstructions, attempts to rebuild something that had existed previously, something the flood had destroyed, something that memory preserved imperfectly but powerfully enough to guide reconstruction. The ziggurat form itself, step platform rising toward heaven, summit temple open to the sky, external staircases climbing the tiers, appears suddenly in Mesopotamian architecture. No developmental stages, no experimental designs. The concept arrives complete, and that concept appears elsewhere, in forms that should not be related. The Egyptian pyramids, though solid rather than hollow, follow similar principles. Massive platforms, precise alignments, geometry encoding astronomical and mathematical constants. The stepped pyramids of Mesoamerica, built by cultures with no contact with Mesopotamia, yet showing the same architectural impulse. Height, alignment, sacred platforms connecting earth to sky. The Ziggurats of Southeast Asia, temple mountains rising from jungle plains, each tier representing a cosmic layer. Summit shrines honoring celestial deities, different materials, different time periods, different cultures, same essential idea. Why would this pattern emerge globally if it were not encoding a shared memory, if it were not reconstructing something that had been seen before? Something that survivors of the flood carried with them as they scattered and rebuilt. The Ziggurats may have been built by Sumerian hands, but the knowledge they encoded, the geometry, the alignments, the function as platforms for divine descent may have come from much further back, from the world before the flood, from teachers the Sumerians called Anunnaki, from the me, the sacred codes that contained the blueprint for rebuilding civilization from ruins. In this sense, the Ziggurats were both Sumerian and pre-Sumerian, physical constructions dating to specific centuries, but conceptual inheritances dating to ages before writing existed to record them. The question is not either or, it is both and. The Sumerians built the Ziggurats we can excavate and measure, but they built them according to principles inherited from something older, something lost, something they were desperately trying to restore before the knowledge faded entirely. The desert wind passes over Iraq, the same wind that blew when these questions first troubled ancient minds, when scribes pressed wedge marks into wet clay, knowing their words might be the last memory of a drowned world. What do we choose to remember from their example? that knowledge is fragile, that catastrophe erases more than it preserves, that every civilization believes itself permanent until the moment it ends. But also this, that memory can survive if we encode it carefully enough, that fragments are better than nothing, that even imperfect preservation across impossible distances of time is a victory against oblivion. The Sumerians succeeded. They preserved enough for us to ask these questions, enough for us to recognize that their sophistication came from somewhere, enough for us to wonder whether history is truly linear or whether it circles back on itself, knowledge rising and falling like tides. And now we face the same choice they did. What will we preserve? What knowledge will we encode for those who come after? What monuments will we build that can survive not just years or centuries, but millennia? The question is not academic, it is urgent, because catastrophe in some form is always approaching. Climate change, nuclear weapons, technological collapse, pandemic, or something we cannot yet imagine. The world will change, violently or gradually, suddenly or slowly, but it will change. And when it does, what we have chosen to preserve will determine whether our descendants rebuild from fragments or from nothing. The Sumerians built in clay, we build in silicon. Their tablets survive, our hard drives decay, their mathematics works without electricity. Our calculations require functioning computers. Their monuments stand exposed to wind and weather. Our knowledge hides behind infrastructure that demands constant maintenance. We are more sophisticated than they were, but we are also more vulnerable. Perhaps we should learn from their example. Not abandoning progress, but supplementing it with durability. Encoding essential knowledge in forms that do not require technology to access. Building monuments that communicate through geometry rather than language. Preserving the source code of our civilization in ways that can survive catastrophe. Because if we succeed, if we encode carefully and preserve thoroughly, then our descendants thousands of years from now might stand in our ruins and ask the same questions we ask about Sumer. Who were they? What did they know? How did they achieve such sophistication? And they might find, pressed into whatever medium we choose, the same message the Sumerians left for us. This is the restoration of what was before. We were here. We knew things you have forgotten. We survived catastrophe you cannot imagine, and we preserved this knowledge so you would remember, so you would understand, so you would know that rebuilding is possible. That is the gift the Sumerians gave us. Not answers, but hope. Not certainty, but evidence that humanity has fallen before and risen again. The Ziggurats stand even in ruin. The tablets speak even across 5,000 years of silence. The mathematics works even when its origins are forgotten. Memory survives if we choose to preserve it. That is the lesson. That is the inheritance. That is what remains when everything else has turned to dust. Good night.